It started with a sound no pilot ever wanted to hear. The deep, violent rattle of an aircraft engine being pushed past its limits. A tortured growl that vibrated through the cockpit and into the bones of every man who dared fly beyond the red line. In the winter of 1943, over the icy blue expanse of the Pacific and the smoldering jungles of Burma, American pilots began to do something that seemed insane. They started deliberately destroying their own engines. To the mechanics who waited on the airstrips, to the engineers back home in Wright Field who had spent years fine-tuning those machines, it sounded like sabotage. But to the pilots up there, locked in desperate battles thousands of feet above enemy lines, it was survival. And more than that, it was the beginning of a new kind of flying. Because when they wrecked those engines, they learned something no textbook could teach. Sometimes breaking the rules made you twice as powerful. The story began not in combat, but in frustration. The kind that comes from realizing your enemy always seems to have just a little more range, a little more endurance, a little more luck. Pilots returning from missions in 1942 spoke in low voices about running out of fuel too early, about limping back to base with sputtering engines while the enemy escaped unscathed. They didn't know it yet, but buried within those moments of panic and exhaustion was the key to unlocking something extraordinary, a hidden potential inside their engines that only appeared when those engines were driven to the edge of destruction. No one understood this better than the ground crews who spent their nights under floodlights, listening to the metallic ticking of cooling cylinders. They saw what the pilots were doing and thought they'd gone mad. Engines came back scorched, spark plugs fused into their sockets, oil filters blackened like tar. But when they tore them open, something unexpected appeared. The damage wasn't random. It was controlled chaos. The pilots weren't just carelessly abusing their machines. They were experimenting with them in the only laboratory that mattered, the sky. By pushing their engines past factory limits, they were mapping the unseen boundaries of performance, discovering that those big radial engines had far more endurance than anyone had dared believe. And the first to notice this pattern wasn't an engineer. It was a pilot who barely made it back from a mission over Rabaul. His name was Major Frank B. Nichols, a man known among his peers for taking his P-47 Thunderbolt to speeds most pilots thought suicidal. On one sortie, his oil temperature spiked into the danger zone, the red needle pinned, but he stayed in the fight. The enemy broke away first, and somehow his engine didn't seize. When he landed, the ground crew expected a melted wreck. Instead, the Pratt & Whitney roared back to life after a few tweaks. That moment ignited a revolution in thinking. Maybe the limits weren't where the manuals said they were. In the following weeks, flight squadrons began whispering a phrase that would soon echo across every Pacific airfield. Fly it like you stole it. It wasn't bravado. It was philosophy. Pilots began to realize that their engines, masterpieces of American engineering, had been designed with enormous safety margins. The engineers, terrified of being blamed for failures, had built in layers of caution that effectively caged the true power of their machines. What happened next blurred the line between madness and genius. Pilots began to run their engines hotter, leaner, faster. They started flying with the throttle shoved forward beyond the combat rating, holding emergency power longer than any manual allowed. Mechanics begged them to stop. "You're going to blow the heads off," one shouted at Nichols after a mission. Nichols grinned and pointed at his intact engine. Not today. What they discovered through these reckless flights was astonishing. By operating beyond safe parameters, the fuel mixture burned cleaner. Power delivery became more efficient and range increased. The engines, paradoxically, ran smoother when pushed. It was as if the machines themselves were waiting for someone brave enough to unleash them. At first, command tried to stop it. Reports reached the brass about pilots abusing equipment. Orders were sent down reminding everyone of the dangers of overboosting, of exceeding maximum RPMs. But results spoke louder than regulations. Squadrons that adopted the abuse method were returning from longer missions, flying farther, fighting harder. Pilots were saving fuel because they'd learned to fly their engines at the edge of detonation, that razor-thin line where combustion efficiency peaked. What seemed like recklessness was, in truth, the birth of a new science, empirical engine management. And as word spread, it reshaped how America's air war was fought. Suddenly, B-25 bombers were flying deeper into enemy territory. P-38s were escorting bombers to targets once thought unreachable. The skies themselves began to change. What was once forbidden became doctrine. Not officially, of course, but in the hearts of the men who trusted their instincts over their instruction manuals. Because while pilots were celebrating their newfound freedom, engineers at Wright Field began to panic. They started receiving engines returned from combat zones that looked like they'd been through a furnace. Metal fatigue, warped pistons, cracked cylinder heads. To them, it looked like madness. They couldn't understand how these machines still flew. One engineer reportedly said, "If these engines truly survived that abuse, our math is wrong, or physics itself has changed." That single statement sparked an investigation that would lead to one of the most important discoveries in the history of flight. That combat conditions had revealed a truth no laboratory ever could. Engines behaved differently under stress, and those differences, those wrecking moments, were rewriting what was possible in aviation. The tests that followed were unlike anything in aviation history. Engineers and pilots together began to run what they called destruction flights. They pushed engines until they failed, noting the exact temperatures, pressures, and RPMs where the failures began. What they found was jaw-dropping. The engines didn't fail where the data said they would. Instead of braking at 3,000 RPMs, they held steady past 3,400. Instead of melting oil seals at 260 degrees, they kept lubricating at 280 degrees. It was as if the engines were alive, adapting to stress, thriving in it. These experiments, born from the chaos of war, revealed that the combat environment itself had forged stronger machines. The vibrations, the shock loads, the continuous operation, all of it tempered the metals, burned away impurities, and transformed the engines from delicate instruments into battle-hardened beasts. Pilots were now flying weapons that had literally evolved through survival, and that terrified the engineers almost as much as it thrilled the airmen. As more units adopted this daring style, the results became impossible to ignore. Mission logs showed that squadrons who flew red line runs, those brutal full-power flights, had a higher success rate, fewer forced landings, and paradoxically, fewer total engine failures. It was the mechanical version of natural selection. Weak engines died early while the strong ones got stronger. The change wasn't just mechanical, it was psychological. Pilots began to feel a bond with their planes that transcended fear. They no longer saw their engines as fragile machines, but as living allies. "If I treat her like she's dying," one pilot said, "she'll die. But if I trust her, she'll carry me home." The phrase spread across squadrons, scribbled on dashboards, engraved on lucky charms, and muttered before missions. This philosophy of trust in abuse became part of American fighter culture, a rebellious, defiant creed that turned mechanical limitations into weapons of dominance. But there was a hidden danger, too. Not every engine could handle it. Some melted mid-air, sending fire through the fuselage. Pilots who pushed too far paid the price. They became cautionary legends, their wreckage a grim reminder that discovery always comes at a cost. Yet those sacrifices didn't slow the others down. They only refined the method. By studying wrecks and recording what failed, pilots and engineers began to identify patterns. It wasn't just random luck. Certain engine types, fuel grades, and altitude conditions allowed for safe overboosting. Soon, informal charts began circulating, drawn by hand, showing how far you could push a Pratt & Whitney or a Wright Cyclone before it screamed for mercy. Every squadron had its own secret recipe, and behind the scenes, these field discoveries began influencing official design. When the next generation of engines rolled off the line, they quietly included what the pilots had proven: higher tolerances, better metallurgy, and a new understanding of how to extract power from chaos. Meanwhile, pilots in the Pacific weren't just flying faster, they were flying farther. Missions that once required emergency fuel dumps or mid-air turnarounds were now running clean and complete. Engineers eventually confirmed what seemed impossible. By running engines harder, pilots were actually conserving fuel. The reason lay deep in combustion dynamics. Running hotter reduced incomplete burn, which meant fewer wasted hydrocarbons. The lean burn effect, dangerous if uncontrolled, was now being harnessed through experience and intuition. What began as rule-breaking became an art form. Pilots could feel the sweet spot of the engine through the stick, through the sound, through the rhythm of the machine. They called it listening to the heart. One mechanic wrote in his diary, "These boys don't fly planes anymore, they play them like instruments." The transformation was so profound that when captured Japanese and German pilots were interrogated, they couldn't understand how American planes stayed in the air so long or dove so far. They thought the U.S. had invented a secret new fuel. The truth was far simpler and far crazier. It wasn't about what they put into the engine, but what they dared to take out of it: fear, caution, and complacency. Every time an American pilot slammed the throttle past the red line, he was rewriting the laws of war. And every time the engine came back screaming but alive, it sent a message that sometimes the only way to find your limits is to shatter them. By mid-1944, reports began to circulate up the chain of command that something extraordinary was happening. Aircraft performance data was exceeding factory benchmarks. P-47s were making longer escort runs. P-38s were holding formation with bombers deeper into Europe than anyone thought possible. And when the Army Air Forces compared maintenance logs, they realized that the abused engines were lasting longer between overhauls than the carefully babied ones. It defied logic, it defied science, but it was true. The pilots had proven that chaos, managed correctly, could outlast caution. And this revelation didn't just change the air war, it changed the future of aviation itself. By the summer of 1944, what had begun as whispered heresy among the squadrons had turned into a quiet revolution spreading across the skies. Pilots now treated their engines not as fragile machines, but as fierce partners in survival. Every flight became a negotiation between destruction and endurance. They learned the subtle language of vibration and pitch, the way a deeper hum at high boost meant the cylinders were happy, while a sharp metallic rattle was the warning to ease off. They didn't need gauges anymore. They could feel it in their bones. Engineers back in the States finally stopped fighting the data and started listening. They set up experimental rigs that duplicated what the pilots had been doing in the field, running engines at maximum manifold pressure for hours, adjusting mixture and timing on the fly. The results were shocking even to them. Engines that had once been rated for a few hundred hours of service kept running for double, sometimes triple their design life. The metal, instead of weakening, became seasoned. Microscopic cracks closed as carbon sealed them, valves seated tighter, rings wore smooth. It was as if the act of ruining the engines had taught them how to live longer. News of these findings spread through the Allied Technical Corps. British test pilots began copying the practice in their Spitfires. Australian crews adopted it for their Kitty Hawks. Even the cautious Navy pilots of the Pacific carriers began running WWII, War Emergency Power, longer than the manuals allowed. The new rule was simple: if you come back alive, it wasn't too much. Command couldn't stop it anymore. The statistics were irrefutable. Fuel efficiency up, mission range up, engine failures down. It made no sense on paper but worked flawlessly in the sky. The irony, everyone said, was beautiful. By breaking the engines, the Americans had learned how not to break them. The ripple effect extended far beyond the front lines. Back home, manufacturers like Pratt & Whitney and Wright Aeronautical quietly began redesigning engines with what they called combat tempering built in. Metals pre-stressed at higher heat, bearings micro-polished, oil systems tuned for leaner mixtures. When these improved power plants reached the field, pilots instantly felt the difference. They were built for abuse, and the men who had once been scolded for recklessness suddenly found themselves teaching the new factory teams how to tune by instinct rather than instrument. War had blurred the line between engineer and pilot. Each had become the other's mirror. By late 1944, the transformation of philosophy was complete. In briefings, flight leaders no longer spoke of safe limits. They spoke of operating envelopes, wide and flexible. Each pilot was responsible for finding his own. The practice demanded courage, but it also demanded respect. Abuse without understanding meant death. Mastery of abuse meant dominance. Every mission became a high-stakes dance with physics itself. When a pilot advanced the throttle into the forbidden zone, he wasn't just defying a manual, he was defying fear. And fear in combat was the deadliest enemy of all. The proof came in blood and smoke over the Pacific. P-47 Thunderbolts escorting bombers to the Philippines routinely returned with fuel to spare. P-38 Lightning-struck targets once thought unreachable. And in Europe, Mustang pilots learned that by wrecking their engines, by flying them lean at altitude, they could chase fleeing Luftwaffe fighters all the way to Berlin and still limp home. It was engine wrecking as a form of liberation. Every evening, when the planes rolled back to base streaked with oil and exhaust, the mechanics would gather under the wings, run oily hands across the metal, and shake their heads in disbelief. These weren't machines anymore. They were legends, each one baptized by fire. And in the cooling tick of contracting metal, they could hear it, the heartbeat of an empire that had learned to turn destruction into power. What no one realized then was that this philosophy, born from desperation, would shape the next century of flight. Jet engines, space rockets, even nuclear power would borrow the same principle. The threshold of failure is where progress begins. In every roar of a modern turbine, you can still hear the ghost of those piston engines screaming past the red line, proving that sometimes the fastest path forward is through controlled chaos. And then came the missions that rewrote everything, the ones where pilots deliberately crossed the line that manuals said was fatal. They would push the throttle past its detent, the manifold pressure surging, the propeller tips nearly breaking the sound barrier. They could feel the aircraft straining, metal shuddering under stress, the cockpit vibrating like a living creature on the edge of madness. But beneath the roar there was something else, a rhythm. The machine was telling them how far it could go. Every pilot who survived one of those missions came back different. They looked at their planes the way soldiers looked at comrades who had taken a bullet and kept walking. They began to trust the engines more than they trusted the gauges, because those dials couldn't feel what they felt, the delicate balance between mechanical agony and mechanical triumph. At night, in the flickering light of maintenance hangars, the real secret emerged. The mechanics, those sleepless magicians, would strip down the abused engines and find something incredible. Instead of cracked pistons and warped valves, many engines looked better. The carbon scoring that was supposed to be death was actually sealing micro-imperfections. The bearing surfaces were polished like mirrors. They realized that by running them too hot, the pilots had effectively forged the metal tighter, burning off impurities, aligning molecular structures the way a blacksmith tempers steel. The pilots had stumbled upon an accidental metallurgy lesson at 20,000 feet. What engineers called overstress was, in reality, self-forging under combat conditions. Those findings spread like wildfire through the technical branches. The Americans called it combat burn-in. British engineers at Rolls-Royce called it flying hardening. German prisoners of war who overheard the tests dismissed it as madness until they saw the engines themselves. The irony was undeniable. The supposedly overstressed engines had less wear than those babied at training bases. It wasn't superstition. It was physics pushed to its poetic extreme. The pilots themselves began to evolve with their machines. They grew bolder but not careless. They learned the exact note of power that meant maximum speed without meltdown. Some said they could feel the propeller bite thinner air through the seat of their pants. It wasn't science, it was art born from survival. A few veterans later compared it to jazz, improvisation within chaos, rhythm born from danger. And like jazz, it was uniquely American. Then came the moments that cemented this philosophy forever. A formation of P-51 Mustangs, deep over enemy territory, found themselves running low on fuel, return seemingly impossible. But instead of throttling back, they did the opposite. They leaned the mixture to near starvation, boosted the manifold pressure, and kept flying. The result? The engine screamed in agony, but they sipped fuel. They reached home base on fumes, every cylinder glowing cherry red. Those who witnessed it swore it made no sense. But it worked. From that day forward, engine abuse became doctrine. Engineers rewrote the manuals. War emergency power became a checkbox, not a warning. Every pilot was now taught how to push just enough to gain power without bursting the cylinders. The result was staggering. Extended range, fewer losses, more victories. America had learned how to turn pain into progress. When the war ended, that spirit didn't die. It became the blueprint of post-war aviation. Jet engines were designed to thrive at redline. NASA test pilots would later quote those same WWII veterans, "If it's not screaming, it's not flying." The same principle lived on in rocket design, controlled destruction as a path to endurance. The ghosts of those piston engines live on in every space launch, every fighter jet's afterburner. A lone Mustang sitting silent on an empty airfield, its once screaming engine cooled, its propeller still. A mechanic wipes grease from his hands, looks at the blackened exhausts, and smiles. Not because the machine survived, but because it thrived in the chaos meant to destroy it. That was America's secret weapon, not just steel or horsepower, but the fearless belief that even destruction can be engineered into victory. The sun had barely risen over the Pacific when the first pilots of the day climbed into their cockpits, the engines idling with a soft hum that belied the chaos that was about to unfold. They knew what awaited them. A flight that would push every component to the edge of survival, every gauge into the red, every spark plug screaming in protest. There was a palpable tension in the air, heavier than the tropical humidity, thicker than the smoke from the bombed-out islands they would soon pass. Mechanics tightened the last bolts with trembling hands, fully aware that what they were about to witness bordered on sacrilege. And then the throttle advanced, the propellers cutting into the morning mist, and the pilots became the first dancers in a deadly ballet of fire, metal, and sheer human instinct. This was no ordinary flight. It was an experiment in the very limits of physics, and a challenge to every assumption anyone had about engines, endurance, and survival in aerial warfare. From the first minute of the climb, the engines groaned, valves flexed, and pistons beat like hearts under immense strain. Pilots leaned forward, reading every vibration, every note of exhaust, interpreting them as instructions from a teacher that only a trained human could understand. The higher they climbed, the thinner the air, the more demanding the flight became. At 20,000 feet, the RPMs pushed past published maximums, temperatures flirted with catastrophic failure, and yet somehow every engine kept running. It was as if the machines themselves had learned the lesson of the pilot's audacity, that survival lay not in obedience, but in carefully measured defiance. Ground crews watched on monitors, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others furiously taking notes. The evidence was undeniable. When pushed, these engines were not destroyed. They were liberated. They could do more, reach further, endure longer than anyone had thought possible. The first hour of flight was a symphony of calculated risk. Pilots alternated between full-throttle climbs, level runs at lean mixtures, and high-speed dives, each maneuver designed to extract the absolute maximum from their machines without sending them into terminal failure. As they executed these extreme tactics, fuel consumption was paradoxically lower than during standard operations. The higher thermal efficiency at extreme settings allowed fuel to burn more completely, converting more energy into propulsion instead of waste. What seemed reckless on the surface, screaming down a strip, shoving the throttle past its supposed limits, was actually a delicate, precise science born from months of experimentation, trial, and painful error. Pilots whispered in the cockpit, "Feel her? Listen to her? She'll tell you." And in that whisper lay the secret of the method. The engine's voice, subtle yet unmistakable, guided every decision. Midway through the mission, clouds of suspicion and skepticism from higher command melted away. Reports of extended flight ranges, previously considered impossible, were now undeniable. Squadron after squadron returned with fuel to spare, sometimes exceeding the planned mission distance by 50%. Engineers could barely reconcile the data. Every test, every manual, every table of expected performance had been proven incomplete by actual combat experience. And the pilots, who risked everything to discover this truth firsthand, knew that no academic experiment could replicate the unique combination of human intuition and mechanical endurance that these flights demanded. Then came the day when a formation of P-38 Lightnings, tasked with a long-range reconnaissance mission over Japanese-held territory, performed what would later be known as the Miracle Flight. Every engine was pushed to its red line continuously. Altitudes soared, fuel pressures dropped, yet they flew further than anyone in the Allied command thought possible. Enemy radar operators reported them as ghosts traversing impossible distances. By the time they returned, mechanics examined the engines with both fear and awe. Metal was scorched, valves had scorched in bright spots, oil scorched to amber, yet nothing had failed catastrophically. It was as if the engines had gained strength from their abuse, hardened under fire, and repaid the pilots with performance that defied reason. The psychological transformation was as dramatic as the mechanical one. Pilots went from fearing engine limits to actively courting them, exploring new techniques to nudge the machines into optimal performance. Engine abuse became a form of art, a choreography of throttle, mixture, and propeller pitch. It was understood that pushing too far could kill the pilot, but pulling back too soon would guarantee failure to achieve the mission. The stakes could not have been higher, and yet the thrill of mastery over the laws of physics made every flight intoxicating. Even the enemy began to feel the impact. Japanese radar operators and ground forces were baffled by the endurance and unexpected range of American aircraft. They could not comprehend how the same P-51 Mustangs and P-38 Lightnings that had always returned early, exhausted and gas-starved, were now striking deep behind their lines, appearing seemingly from nowhere and retreating without attrition. The advantage was both mechanical and psychological. Pilots had learned to bend machines and physics in tandem, while enemies could not anticipate how far and how fast they could be pursued. By the final minutes of each mission, as pilots throttled back just enough to ensure they would return, they felt the engine's heartbeat slow to a purr, a stark contrast to the screaming push of the first hour. That balance between destruction and endurance, risk and control, had become their signature. Ground crews would often remark on the synchronicity. You could see the pilot and the engine breathing together, and in that intimate bond lay the secret of doubling operational range, outsmarting enemies, and achieving what manuals had deemed impossible. As the last planes touched down on the airstrip, engines ticking and cooling in the heavy afternoon heat, the mechanics and pilots alike paused, catching their breath, listening to the echo of their daring etched into every cylinder, every piston, every scarred propeller. They had flown further than anyone had thought possible, had pushed metal and fire into harmony, and had survived the unthinkable. The stories of this day would ripple through squadrons, whispered in mess halls, scrawled on checklists, and engraved into the legends of airmen who learned to treat destruction as a teacher. And yet, even in this moment of triumph, the pilots knew the sky still held secrets. The limits they had tested were only the beginning. Somewhere above, beyond the horizon, lay new challenges, new thresholds of danger, new ways to bend engines and physics in tandem, waiting for the brave and the daring. The sun dipped low, painting the plains in gold, and every pilot felt the unspoken truth. Mastery over machinery was mastery over destiny, and those who understood it would fly further, faster, and into the heart of history itself. The morning sun rose like fire over the Pacific, painting the ocean in molten gold, as American pilots climbed into their cockpits with a mixture of fear, exhilaration, and unspoken anticipation. They knew the engines beneath them had limits, limits written in manuals, limits tested in laboratories, but in the air, over vast stretches of sea and jungle, those limits were invitations to discovery. The first few minutes of every flight were tense, the turbines humming with restrained fury, the pistons rattling as if aware of the audacity about to be demanded of them. Mechanics on the ground watched silently, some in awe, some in terror, as the pilots advanced throttles past recommended red lines, hearing the engines scream in protest, feeling the vibrations pulse through the aluminum frame, yet knowing that each vibration, each note, was a signal, a guide. A whisper from the machine that said, "I can endure more," But you must listen. What began as mechanical torture quickly became a symphony of precision, a dance between human courage and engineering resilience, where every throttle adjustment, every lean mixture setting, every controlled surge of manifold pressure was a stroke in a living masterpiece that defied physics and expectation. In these flights, pilots discovered phenomena no engineer could replicate in controlled conditions. Engines that should have failed within minutes instead ran smoother. Fuel efficiency paradoxically increased under extreme power, and propeller tips cut through the thin, high-altitude air as if slicing silk. They realized that the very act of pushing the engine past its supposed safety limit triggered a kind of adaptive response. Metal surfaces aligned under stress, combustion chambers cleaned themselves through precise overheating, and the rhythmic vibration tempered internal components to a greater tolerance than any factory could instill. By the time the planes reached operational altitude, the pilots had become extensions of the machines, sensing the microtones of engine performance in their seat, hands, and chest, interpreting subtle changes in sound and vibration to modulate power with almost supernatural precision. It was instinct honed under fire, a language shared only between human and machine, and it transformed ordinary men into aerial alchemists capable of transmuting risk into unrivaled endurance. The applications of this knowledge were immediate and revolutionary. Fighters could now escort bombers to targets previously considered unreachable, arriving with engines that had been stressed to extremes yet emerged intact, often outperforming conservative expectations by margins that shocked intelligence analysts and command officers alike. Fuel consumption, once the limiting factor in planning missions, became a secondary concern as pilots mastered the delicate balance between overboost and overheat. Airmen who had once returned exhausted after mere sorties now routinely flew distances double the length predicted by manuals, pushing deeper into enemy territory, extending the reach of reconnaissance, and striking strategic points previously thought safe from Allied intervention. Every mission became a testament to the synergy between daring and engineering, a vivid illustration that limits were only theoretical until tested in practice. Yet with these achievements came consequences, and the lessons were seared into the memory of those who dared. Engines that were pushed too far without understanding failed spectacularly. Pistons fused in a flash, bearings seized, and entire cylinder banks were destroyed mid-flight, sending planes into spirals of fire and smoke. These tragedies were instructive, creating a grim but essential calculus of risk. Pilots learned to differentiate between calculated abuse and reckless destruction. The line was thin, razor-sharp, and crossing it demanded the full measure of skill, courage, and intuition. Manuals could not teach it. Only repetition, observation, and a willingness to confront the limits of both metal and human endurance could. In a strange twist, these near catastrophes refined the method, revealing which engines could endure specific abuse patterns and which combinations of altitude, mixture, and RPM were sustainable over long distances. The psychological impact on the pilots was profound. Those who mastered this technique gained confidence, a visceral trust in their machines, and a new understanding of aerial combat dynamics. Enemy pilots, on the other hand, were baffled. The Americans seemed to appear from nowhere, to reach further, and to outmaneuver heavier and more conventional aircraft effortlessly. Their tactics evolved in tandem with their mechanical mastery. Daring climbs, sudden dives, and extended dogfights that relied not on raw horsepower, but on precise manipulation of engine behavior. What the Axis could not account for was this intimate, almost symbiotic understanding between man and machine. It was improvisation, calculation, and intuition rolled into one, forged under the heat of combat and tempered by meticulous observation. By the end of every sortie, pilots returned not merely victorious but transformed. Engines were examined, oil was drained, pistons were measured, and the data recorded, creating a feedback loop that advanced knowledge at a pace far beyond the laboratory. Lessons learned in a single day could inform tactics for weeks, altering strategy across theaters of war. And yet, despite all this technical mastery, the pilots never lost a sense of reverence. They knew the razor's edge of power they walked was perilous. They respected the engines that had survived abuse, knowing that one miscalculation could turn triumph into disaster in seconds. The thrill, the fear, the understanding of forces beyond ordinary comprehension, all of it coalesced into a singular truth. Mastery over engines was mastery over destiny in the sky, and those who embraced this dangerous art became architects of unprecedented aerial endurance.